Okay, let's see who's here. Oh, I see George Costanza's in the class. I did not know that. All right. I have a feeling George is not a good student, is he? He's not good at anything, is he? No, not really. All right. Well, anyway, so here's what we're going to do today. We have a problem set that I want to work on with you because it involves, yes, it involves comparative advantage, which we'd like to, make sure we understand that before we go on any further. So I posted on Moodle. And then again, this is just something for the review. If you go to Moodle, you'll see that there is a problem set there. And let's see. Oh, okay. Wait, I thought I had it. Let's go log into our class. Here we go. Economics 3200. There we go. The global economy. So yes, I did put those up there the other day. So what we're going to do here, this is more for practice than anything else, just to make sure we're keeping up and to answer any questions you may have about how comparative advantage works. And then when we're done with this, we're going to take a look at chapter 3, where they're attempting to explain what's going on behind the scenes. In other words, how and why do countries actually acquire a comparative advantage? And now, this is something that's been the subject of a lot of research throughout economics history, really, going all the way back to, let's say, the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in 1776. But a lot, of course, of research was done in the 20th century to help us try to understand how and why countries can, in fact, acquire a comparative advantage and what factors lead up to it. And as like all other areas of research, there's a lot of controversy about it. But there's certain basic features that we'll see that are always going to help a country gain an advantage over others with the production of goods and services. So, but that'll have to come next. First, we have to look at these questions. And so first, what I'm going to do is open up the questions so you can see them as we go along. All right, let's see. Hold on one second. So again, this is problem set number 1, I think I called it. Why, yes, it is right there. Okay, so we start out with a case where we have the US and Brazil, and each of them is capable of producing tea and coffee. Now, what this chart shows us is how much labor is needed to make each of these products. All right, so you can see that in the US, a pound of tea can be made with 1 hour of labor. In Brazil, it takes 6 hours. Let's say that for whatever reason, the soil in Brazil is not particularly well suited to growing tea, whereas in the US, let's say that it is. And then coffee, it's the other way around. It takes in the US 3 hours of labor to make 1 pound of coffee and only 1 hour in Brazil. So therefore, it's pretty clear just by looking at this chart that the US will have the advantage in the area of tea producing and Brazil in the area of coffee. Okay, now what we want to do though is answer these questions right here. And so we'll start with the first one, and you can see what is the opportunity cost that the US incurs in order to produce 1 pound of tea. So now keep in mind, whenever you calculate an opportunity cost, you're always going to write the ratio of what's being sacrificed to what's being gained. Okay, so for the US, making a pound of tea requires, let's see, hold on a second. If I make a pound of tea, I'm using up an hour of labor. So in the denominator of this ratio I'm about to create, I've gained 1 pound of tea, but how much coffee did I give up? All right, let me type this in here. So the opportunity cost, hold on. Of producing 1 pound of tea. So what we have to ask ourselves is, how much do we lose to make that tea? So that same hour that's being used to produce tea can't also be used to make coffee, but 1 hour of labor is only enough to make 1/3 of a pound of coffee. Why a third? Because if it takes 3 hours to make a pound of coffee, each hour of labor only produces 1/3 of a pound of coffee. So the ratio that we have here is 1/3 of a pound of coffee sacrificed, and we take that ratio and compare it to the gain of a pound of tea. And so we can write this as simply 1/3 pound of coffee, or even just 1/3 if you want to. So that's how we calculate the opportunity cost. Now, on the other hand, let's look at the opposite case. Let's look at the coffee. Now, this is easy because we're basically just reversing or flipping over this ratio, because now what we're thinking about is the opportunity cost of producing a pound of coffee. So in a case like this, if I use 3 hours of labor to produce a pound of coffee, those same 3 hours of labor could have been used to produce 3 pounds of tea. So in order to gain 1 more pound of coffee, I've had to sacrifice 3 hours of tea, 3 pounds of tea rather. So the ratio is the sacrifice is 3 pounds of tea. The gain of coffee is 1 pound. So this ratio is 3 pounds of tea. Okay. Now, one thing we can point out here, though, is that you don't really here even have to really think about it, because the opportunity cost of one good is the inverse of the opportunity cost of the other good. So in other words, as soon as you see that the opportunity cost of the tea is 1/3, that implies that the opportunity cost of the coffee must be 3. All right, so that kind of saves us a little time, but you should still be able to reason it out logically. It's always, how much do we give up to get one item or 1 unit of the item that we're gaining? Now let's compare that with Brazil. Now for Brazil, we'll look at their production here. So the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of tea. So how do we look at it? 1 pound of tea requires 6 hours of labor in Brazil, which translates into 6 pounds of coffee. So that means what we're giving up is 6 pounds of coffee are sacrificed in order to gain just 1 pound of tea. So the ratio is simply 6 pounds of coffee. Or you can think it was just 6. Okay. So already you can see that as far as opportunity costs are concerned, in the US, the tea only costs 1/3 of a pound of coffee. And in Brazil, it costs 6 pounds of coffee, which means it's pretty clear that the US has the comparative advantage in the tea, because we have to sacrifice less coffee to make it. Then we'll flip this over and we'll think about, what opportunity cost does Brazil incur in order to produce a pound of coffee? So here we're saying the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of coffee. And here, if you look at it very carefully, you'll see that 1 pound of coffee is required to make a pound of coffee is 1 hour, and that would only let us produce 1/6 of a pound of tea. So therefore, we have 1/6 pound of tea sacrificed over 1 pound of coffee or gained coffee. And that is 1/6, of course. But of course, as I also mentioned before, it is simply the inverse of this opportunity cost. So the two of them will always be inverses of each other, because you can see if you look at the ratio, here it's coffee over tea, here it's tea over coffee. So now you can see their opportunity cost in the form of coffee is really low. 1/6 of a pound compared to the United States, 3 pounds of tea. So therefore, the long and short of all this is that absolute advantage, remember, means who can make this product the most cheaply. So when it comes to tea, all that matters is that it takes the US 1 hour to make tea, 6 hours in Brazil. That means the US has the absolute advantage in the production of tea. Okay, and so US, because it only takes 1 hour to produce a pound of tea, compared with 6 hours in Brazil. Now, it doesn't ask you for all that, but that's the reason why it's the United States. Now, keep in mind here too, unlike with comparative advantage, the same country can have the absolute advantage in both goods. That's not the way it's working here, though, because with the coffee, it takes the US 3 hours to make it and only 1 hour in Brazil. So this time, each country has an area of its absolute advantage. This one, in this case, we say Brazil because it takes 3 hours, 1 hour to produce a pound of coffee. Compared with 3 hours in the US. And that's all it takes to have an absolute advantage. Who can make this product the most cheaply or with the fewest resources? That's the bottom line. But with the absolute values, we've already figured it out. I'm sorry, the comparative advantages, since the US has an opportunity cost of only, let's go back and get that. The opportunity cost for tea in the US is 1/3 of a pound of coffee. Compared with, in Brazil, the opportunity cost of coffee, of tea rather, is 6 pounds of coffee. So therefore, the US has the comparative advantage in the production of tea. And here, the key point is the lower opportunity costs. All right, actually, I'm going to split this so I don't have to keep rolling back. 800,000 tons. Yes, I need this chart. All right, so in tea, the US has an opportunity cost of 1/3 versus 3 in Brazil. 3 in Brazil. Okay, 6 rather. Okay, now with the coffee, so here we say that since Brazil has an opportunity cost of, so for them, making coffee has an opportunity cost of 1/6 of a pound of tea. Okay, and the US has an opportunity cost of, let's see, 3 pounds of tea. Brazil has the comparative advantage in the production of coffee. Okay, and there you go. So we figured out, based on opportunity costs, we've been able to figure out who has the comparative advantage in each good and also the absolute advantage. But as we know, trade will ultimately depend not so much on absolute advantage, but on comparative advantage. So this would suggest that Brazil should specialize in and export coffee, while the US should specialize in and export the tea. Okay. Now, suppose that based on the previous problem, which, all right, let me split the screen again so we can continue to see the chart, because we'll need it. We'll keep that in front of us at all times. So we're being told now how many resources the two countries actually have. So we've already decided that the US should specialize in tea. And so we're being told here that the US has 1,800 hours available to it, of labor, that is. So if we only make tea, and it only takes an hour to make tea, that means the US can produce 1,800 hours of labor over 1 pound per hour of tea. That translates into 1,800 pounds of tea. Okay. On the other hand, if we make coffee, which we won't, but let's say we did, and nothing but coffee, the US can produce, now we have 1,800 hours over 3 hours per pound of coffee, which means we can only make 600 pounds of coffee if that's all that we do. All right. So those are the points of specialization. We can make 1,800 hours of tea and 600 hours of coffee. On the other hand, look at Brazil. Now, remember, we were told that Brazil has only 1,500 hours of labor. So what can they do with it? If they make tea, $1,500 hours divided by 6 hours per pound of tea, which means they can only make 250 pounds of tea if they put all their resources into it. Now, on the other hand, if they just make coffee, Brazil can produce 1,500 hours over 1 hour equals per pound of coffee, that is 1,500 pounds of coffee. Okay, so that was pretty straightforward. All right, so what are we going to do now? We're going to make an assumption here. Let's say that in the absence of trade, the US both, now, by the way, when there's no trade, you can only produce, or you can only consume what you produce. So the US produces and consumes, or prior to trade, let me put it that way. US produces and consumes 500 pounds of coffee, 300 pounds of tea. Brazil produces and consumes 200 pounds of tea and 300 pounds. Oh, let me line these up. Let me do it this way, just so you can see them side by side. 300 pounds of coffee and 200 pounds of tea. So now, what does this curve look like in the absence of trade? All right, so we have to be careful with this. Now, by the way, we're going to assume that the production possibilities curve in this case is a straight line. I just realized now it doesn't actually say that, but that's what we're going to assume, just to keep things simple. So what would these curves look like? Also, it does specify that we should put coffee in the vertical axis and tea in the horizontal axis. That way we'll all end up with the same graph. Coffee and tea. So again, remember, the US is capable of making, as we saw in the previous question, 600 pounds of coffee or 1,800 pounds of tea or something in between. And they've chosen to produce, because, let's face it, Americans love coffee, 500 coffee and 300 tea. Okay, so this point represents both consumption and production because we're not trading. This is the US. Now, in part B with Brazil, we're going to do the exact same thing. Okay. But now keep in mind, the amount that they're capable of producing in Brazil is very different. In fact, if you look back here, you'll see that they're limited to 250 pounds of tea, although they can make 1,500 pounds of coffee. They're very efficient with the coffee. So what does their curve look like? Okay, so the curve will be quite steep compared to the US. We're limited to 1,500 coffees and 250 teas. And so this is a very steep curve compared to the US. And the point at which they choose to produce and consume is given to us as 300 and 200. Let's say that's right about here. 300 coffees, 200 teas. Well, very well. Now, of course, you know what's going to happen in the next section. The countries will specialize and they will choose to export their surplus to the other country. And we'd like to know how much that will increase output in the two countries. So, because we expect this to make everybody better off. So let's see how that actually works. All right, I got these out of order. Here we go. All right, that's the curve for Brazil in the absence of trade. Now, each decides that would make sense to specialize, and this is how much we're going to trade with each other. So in the case of the US, this is what you have to visualize. The US is pretty good at making tea. So what they're going to do is move down this curve. In fact, let me copy this so we can draw on it again without messing it up. So we were told that the US will specialize in coffee. So we moved, let's say this is point A, this is point B. Now they're trading 600 pounds of tea for 600 pounds of coffee. So that means we'll end up with 1,200 teas and 600 coffees, right about here, let's say. All right, so A represents with trade, without trade. B means with specialization. And C means with trade. Actually, what I should say is with specialization and trade. Because both of them have to take place. Okay. So we go from A to B to C. Now, it should be pretty clear that we've somehow found ourselves outside of the production possibilities curve. Now, you might recall from our discussion about this that with specialization and trade, the U.S. has reached a point that was not feasible without trade. Okay, so in some books, what they'll do is they'll illustrate this by showing that you have, in effect, a new curve where it's shifted out compared to the original position. So, we don't need to go any further here, but you can see this is the new production possibilities curve, and this is the old one. And clearly, we're now in a spot that was not possible before. So what is making this possible? It's trade. All right. So that's the trade, or those are the gains. And so the question is, how much of each good will the U.S. consume after trade takes place? So we've just gotten through proving that the U.S. will now produce 1,800. Oh, they didn't ask about that. Okay. So we'll now consume we now have 500 coffees and 600 coffees and 1,200 teas. And that's based on this graph up here. Right, exactly. Okay, now, what about Brazil? All right, let's draw their picture. Remember, the trade is 600 for 600. Actually, let me label this again. These were before trade. So I'm going to label these again, just so it's crystal clear. This is the U.S. before trade. And this is Brazil before trade. Oh, sorry, it already says that. Before trade. Okay, and then this one is now after trade, or with trade, I guess we'll call it. Now, as far as Brazil is concerned, let's see what their curves look like. Now, remember, they're trading 600 coffees for 600 teas. So we go from here, let's call this A. This is where we started out. This is B with specialization. And now, by trading away 600 of these coffees, they end up with about 900, but they also wind up with 600 teas. So let's say that's about here. Now, I just noticed this is very unfortunate that there's two C's up here. Remember, this means coffee and this means tea. This is point A, B, and C. So, oh, look at that. Okay, so you can see that Brazil winds up also in a position that it could not have achieved before This is the old production possibilities curve. This is the new one. So this is Brazil with trade. And what we notice, and the question is going to be, how much are they consuming in now? So Brazil will now consume, we have 600 pounds of coffee. Oh, wait a minute, I just realized, no, that's not right. This is supposed to be 900. You know why? Because we made 1,500 pounds of coffee, but we traded away, 600. We have 900 coffees and 600 teas. That's better. So now Brazil can consume 600 pounds of coffee, or 900 pounds of coffee, and 600 pounds of tea. Okay. Now, what I would like to do, it doesn't ask us to do this. I'd like to show you what it used to look like. So again, before trade, let me just copy those results from down here. Before we had trade, we had these two results. With trade, with the US now produces and consumes 600 pounds of coffee and 1,200 pounds of tea. Brazil produces no, sorry, nope, that's not right. The U.S. is not producing any coffee at all. All right, let me change this again. Actually, for this part, I really, I want to split it up. The U.S. is specializing in coffee. So, all right, I'll tell you what, let me do this a little bit differently. I want to be able to compare what I want side by side. So let's do this. With trade, let's try it this way. Before trade, let's make a little chart here. I think that might be easier to follow. I'm going to create a little table. So we have the US and Brazil. We have coffee and tea. So what I want to start out here with is how much each produced. This is production. So prior to trade, the US was producing and consuming. All right, that's the number we need here. All right, so we were making, the US, 500 pounds of coffee and 300 pounds of tea. And Brazil was making 300 pounds of coffee and 200 pounds of tea. But now we need the totals. All right. Okay, because we want to compare how much world output changed as a result, as well as consumption. Okay, now after trade, how much are these countries producing? Well, the US is only making tea now, no coffee. But how much tea are we making? We're making quite a bit of it. We specialize and we end up with 1,800 pounds of tea. Whereas in Brazil, they're making no tea and they're using all the resources to make coffee. And they ended up with 1,500 pounds of coffee. So you can see all of a sudden, between the two countries, we have 1,500 pounds of coffee and 1,800 pounds of tea. So world output, which is the next question, world output of coffee increased by 700 pounds between the two countries, and the tea went up by 1,300. £1,300. Okay, I think that's easier than what I was about to do here. Now, I would also like, even though they didn't ask for this, I'd like to do the same thing for consumption. And just so we can see what the consumption patterns look like. So before trade, consumption, the US initially had, their initial no trade point was 500 coffees and 300 teas. And Brazil was, let's see, they were at 300 coffees and 200 teas. Now, with trade, the US is now able to consume, here we go, 600 coffees and 1,200 teas. Whereas Brazil is now consuming 900 coffees and 600 teas. So how much do they gain? How much has consumption increased? Okay, in the US, we've gained 100 coffees and we've gained 900 teas. In Brazil, we've gained 600 coffees and we've gained 400 teas. Okay. And if you notice, the total gain in consumption is 700 coffees and 1,300 teas, which makes sense because we've already seen that the total gain in production is also, from up here, 700 coffees, 1,300 teas. It has to be the same, okay? So, but you can see we have more output, and as a result, both countries have a significant amount more of both coffee and tea without any increase in resources. So this is really kind of the thrust of what we're doing. And so from the consumer's perspective, this is really what this is all about. And we are able to have more of both without any change in resources. And so that is really a demonstration of what happens when countries specialize in and export the goods in which they have a comparative advantage. Now, it's not necessarily the case that both countries benefit equally. You notice how Brazil gained more coffees than we did, but we gained more teas than they did. It doesn't matter. As long as both sides are better off than they were before, we're both benefiting from trade. All right, so, okay, I hope that this, all of this covers essentially any questions you might encounter on any exam that might come along that involves comparative advantage. I don't think we left anything out of this. It should all be there. Okay, so that to me is a good way to make sure that you really understand these concepts. If you can do the numbers, then everything else just falls right into place. So when we're done, I'll post these on Moodle So yes, I am. Good question. I'm going to post these on Moodle so that you can study this anytime you please. All right. Because yes, there's a lot going on in here. And I'm sure that it was not possible to write all this stuff down, but you'll have it all the graphs, all the calculations. And so I'm hoping that this will make things a lot easier for you. Okay, and let me make one more quick change here, just to make things as simple as possible. And what else do we need? How about this? Just to make sure that it's clear what's going on with these letters. Let's see. Okay, I think that's good enough. Everything should be there. All right, that should do it. All right, so now we can get back to the material. Now, we did start at least to look at chapter 3. We didn't get very far, but we started to look at it. Remember, what we're talking about here is what exactly is driving comparative advantage in the first place. Now, this is the part that's very somewhat controversial. Everybody can agree that comparative advantage is what really drives trade patterns. The question is, how and where does this come from? And what happens too sometimes is that we find results in the real world that may seem somewhat contradictory. And so the point of the theory is to help us offer explanations for when we find areas where the theory doesn't work. Now, keep in mind too, conditions in the world have obviously changed since David Ricardo was writing in 1817. So a lot of what he was writing at the time may have been perfectly accurate, but it has stopped being accurate since then, only because so many new types of products have been developed in the meantime. And so a lot of the new theories are designed to help explain how Ricardo's basic ideas were right, but now certain circumstances have changed, and we want to understand how that affects comparative advantage and the patterns of trade. All right, so let's skip ahead to where we left off last time, where we were looking at, let's see, right around here, I think. I think we mentioned this, the winners and losers from trade. Now, of course, the thing about trade is the unfortunate reality is that somebody often loses from trade. There's a lot of winners, but there can be losers as well. Now, in the assignment that we were just looking at, if you look at it back at it again, let me go get it back. Here it is. What you'll discover here is even though the US had a very inefficient coffee industry, when we specialize entirely in tea, it means that people in the coffee industry are actually all losing their jobs. It was an inefficient industry, and that's fine, but they do have to be retrained to do something else. That's where the controversy comes in. What do you do with the people who are losing their jobs because of this specialization? And in Brazil, the same thing is happening in the tea industry. They're basically not producing tea any longer, so the tea workers have to go find jobs somewhere else. Maybe in the coffee industry, but that depends on how easily it is to transfer their skills into the coffee industry. Now, of course, what you're seeing here is that in each country, it's the inefficient industry that's disappearing and the efficient one that's growing, and that's fine, but there are still people who may be left behind if we're not careful. And so when it says here, the winners and losers from trade, this is what they're referring to. So this Stolper-Samuelson theory is an attempt to explain how incomes change as a result of trade. For example, if we sell goods in which we have abundant resources, that drives up the price of that resource in the domestic market. Okay, so for example, if we sell aircraft to China, and remember, aircraft are capital intensive goods. They're not built by hand, that's for sure. They're built with a lot of heavy machinery. And also, the labor that they do use is highly, highly specialized because they're mainly engineers and software designers and that type of thing. So the demand for those skills will go up, which means the cost of capital in the United States will go up, which is fine for the owners of that capital and for the people who work in this industry. In China, because they're basically giving up and building their own aircraft, the demand for capital in China will drop, and so the capital owners in China will actually lose out because their incomes will fall as the returns to capital fall in that country. All right. On the other hand, if we're buying clothes from China, now remember, we're assuming that people who are making clothes by hand in the US and in China are relatively unskilled. All right, well, there's some skill involved, but it's not quite the same. We're going to think of that as unskilled labor. The demand for unskilled labor in the US falls, which drives down their wages. In China, it's the other way around. There's a demand for a huge demand increase for unskilled labor, and so unskilled wages will rise. So there's the rub. What happens to those people who were previously making clothes in the United States? Either their incomes are falling or else they're losing their jobs altogether. In China, it's the people who worked in the capital intensive industries who are losing out. So who wins from this? The owners of the capital, which includes, by the way, the highly specialized labor, and the unskilled laborers in China are the winners. And the losers, so to speak, are the capital owners in China and the unskilled laborers in the United States. All right. So in other words, we don't want to ignore this side of it either. Whereas, in Ricardo's time, there's an assumption that if this happened, it would be easy for these workers to be absorbed into another industry. But now we're seeing that that isn't necessarily always the case. All right. Now, yes, they're like all models. These theories we've been looking at tend to be based on several very strong assumptions. What we're assuming here is that labor and capital can easily move in and out of different industries within a country like the United States, but it would be much harder to move into a new country. I think we can live with that assumption. In other words, if you were a worker in the United States, let's say you're a textiles worker and you've been making clothes and suddenly your job disappears, it would probably be easier to find another job in the US than in, let's say, France. Partially, of course, because of the language barrier, because the labor laws are different. And of course, a lot of people simply would not be willing to move to a foreign country. So labor and capital are considered to be mobile, it's called, within industries in the US, but it's much harder for them to move across countries. And in fact, this is actually one of the reasons why the European Union was created, to make it easier for workers in, let's say, France or Spain or Germany or Italy to move around and find jobs in the other countries in the European Union. Oh, and we'll talk about that later on too. Free trade agreements like the European Union. Anyway, of course, in practice, labor and capital are not terribly mobile, even in the short run in the same country. Labor in particular tends to be very specialized. It's not the case that a textile worker can quickly and easily learn how to do something completely different. It takes time and training and all the rest. So it doesn't happen overnight. Even capital, the machinery that's used to build aircraft is not necessarily going to be usable in the auto industry. It's not exactly the same thing. Okay, so the specific factors theory analyzes what happens to income distribution when these factors are not readily what we call mobile or immobile in this case. So here, for example, the capital used to produce steel cannot be used in other industries, but let's say labor can. All right, probably labor is more adaptable to other industries than capital. And let's just say that at the moment, which is probably true, we have a comparative disadvantage in the production of steel. As you know, a city like Pittsburgh used to be based on the steel industry. Now, pretty much steel has disappeared from the area. So that caused a lot of problems, as you can imagine. although apparently the city is making a comeback, it was a very long and hard adjustment. Is anyone here from Pittsburgh? And I guess you could say the same thing with Detroit. Let's face it, the primary employers in Detroit for all those years was the auto industry, which is, of course, shrinking all the time, partially due to foreign competition. And so Detroit is not nearly as well off as it was, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. So if we buy steel from abroad, because we have a comparative disadvantage, then wages in the steel industry will fall. Steel workers will lose their job, and presumably they'll move into more competitive industries where the US has a comparative advantage. So therefore, the capital in the steel industry also loses some of its value, and the returns to the owners will fall. But on the other hand, in the new industries, let's say the steel workers wound up in the, let's say, software industry, that actually makes them more productive. So the returns to capital in these industries, where we're likely to have a comparative advantage, will go up. So the bottom line here, let me summarize this a little bit. As labor moves out of industries such as steel and into industries such as software, the returns to labor and capital in the steel industry will fall and will increase in the software industry. And of course, this is exactly where we have our comparative advantage. So you can imagine those industries will expand and they will end up exporting a large amount of their products to foreign countries. So in other words, the US loses any comparative advantage it had in steel, but gains a comparative advantage in software. Okay. So this is what's happening over time. And you know that this is happening. A lot of US industries are disappearing. In small stages, the US becomes less competitive. Labor and capital move out of those industries and into other areas where we have a comparative advantage. The problem is what happens to the steel workers who are, maybe it's hard to train them to do something different. So the owners of capital in the steel industry are losing. The owners of capital in the more competitive industry are actually gaining. So when you ask people who favors trade and who doesn't, the people who work in the steel industry will say we hate it. And the people who work in the software industry will say we love it, because trade is costing jobs in the steel industry, but it's helping increase jobs in the software industries. So therefore, you may see, and this happens a lot, we'll see more of this in chapter 4, the steel industry lobbies the government for protection from foreign imports. And what that does is it raises the returns of capital in the industry, but then it increases the cost of steel to all American consumers, because a lot of products, of course, require the use of steel. So they're gaining at the expense of everybody else in the country. And in addition, you can make the case that the government is then propping up an industry which is becoming less and less efficient compared to the rest of the world. So a lot of people would question whether this makes sense or not. So yes, and again, the restrictions on trade will be the subject matter of chapters 4 and 5, where we'll analyze these in more detail. Now, here's an interesting discussion. This is something, if you've had a micro class, you would have seen some of this before. Economies of scale and comparative advantage. All right, this is one possible reason why countries can obtain a comparative advantage. Economies of scale occur when a company or an entire industry finds that as it increases its output, average costs of production are actually falling. So you could say that in an industry like this, it pays to be big. And you can tell this is really happening because if you notice, there are certain industries where all the firms are enormous, where being huge is a huge advantage. Like, for example, in retailing, um, supermarkets are getting just bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. It's getting very difficult for small supermarkets to survive. And this is one of the reasons, because the big supermarkets have a cost advantage that the little guys just don't have. And so you can tell in any industry where there's, let's say the firms are getting enormous, most likely it's because of economies of scale. All right, so we're going to define two basic kinds of economies of scale, as you can see. Internal, which means internal to that company or industry, and external, which comes from sources outside of their direct control. In other words, these are things that they have no control over, but they still may benefit from it anyway. All right. Internal economies of scale. They occur within a firm or industry. Now, think about this situation. An industry like auto manufacturing, you don't, well, all right, I shouldn't say, you do rarely see small auto manufacturers. Some, you might see a very specialized company that makes a fairly small number of cars, but for the most part, auto manufacturing is done by large companies. Why is that? Because they need enormous quantities of capital equipment in order to build cars. It's just that simple. It has to be done with machinery, which is very, very expensive. Okay, yes, go ahead. Somebody raised their hand. I'm not sure how that's supposed to work. I guess you can type your question into the chat room.
Um, can I ask with
Yeah.
my microphone?
Go
All
ahead.
right. Why is it called economies of scale? Like, could you break down what like that term means?
Okay, it means basically scale means size. Okay, so as you get bigger, you become more efficient and the cost of producing your product goes down. Okay, that's really what it means. In other words, you get so big that you can spread your cost over a larger number of units of the product, and the average cost of each one will start to fall. Now, I do have some nice numerical examples in here, which I hope will make it easier to understand that. But it's just a case where bigger, as you get bigger, like here's an example. Like if you are a very large company like Walmart, now, why is Walmart so crazy successful? It's partially because they offer everything under the sun to consumers, but the big attraction is what? The costs are pretty low. Their prices are typically lower than for other retail stores. So it's not just the selection, it's the prices. Now, how do they do this? Well, because the company is so large that when they buy products, they can get quantity discounts that a smaller store could not get. So if they're going to buy, for example, let's say 100,000 units of paper towels, they're going to pay a lower price than a smaller store that only needs, let's say, 1,000 units. And so they can save money on their own costs because they're so big, and then they can offer their customers a lower cost as well, and therefore they end up making money because everybody comes there because of their lower prices. So in a case like that, being big gives them an enormous advantage over their competitors. Same thing with Amazon. Amazon is so big that if they decide to buy something, you can be sure they're going to get an extremely good price on whatever it is. Like if they find that they're selling a lot of jeans, let's say, they go to Levi's and say, listen, Levi's, we'll carry your jeans, but you've got to offer us a really good price. And that's exactly what happens. They're in a position that they can order massive quantities of jeans and therefore save money. And so that would be an example of economies of scale. Again, the whole idea is that as you get bigger, your costs are going down. Does that help?
I think it helps describing what you said. I was just confused on like the way that it's phrased.
Oh, okay. All right.
How
Well, let me
how
give you another example. How about this one? Suppose that Microsoft develops the new version of Windows. Now, when you buy Windows, are you buying a physical product? Not really. I mean, you're downloading software onto your hard drive. How much does that cost them to deliver that to you? Nothing. All right. So let's say that Microsoft spends $100 million to develop Windows. Well, the thing is, once they've paid that enormous expense, every copy that they sell you is bringing in more money without incurring any further expenses. So once they've covered the cost of that initial development, every sale after that is essentially all pure profit. So the bigger they get, the more copies of Windows they can sell, the more money they'll make because it's easier to cover those initial expenses. And then after that, all the rest is just pure profit. So it pays Microsoft to get big because if they're not big enough, they can't ever completely cover all their development costs. Does that work? Does that analogy work? So you can see why it pays Microsoft to get big, because the cost of making Windows is the same whether they're a tiny little company or an enormous company. Good. All right. But don't worry, as we do more examples, it'll start to make sense. Just remember, the whole point is that when you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you're selling more units of the product, and that can reduce the cost of making each one. Because the expenses, and a lot of the expenses are fixed no matter what volume we sell. So the more we sell, the lower the cost per unit will be. All right, so now for cars, once we've invested in all this equipment, the more cars we make, the more the cost of this equipment is spread out over a larger number of cars, and the cost per unit is actually going down. Now, I think once you see this numerical example, I think this will help a lot. Imagine that this is, let's say it's Chrysler. They spend $10 million to buy the equipment needed to make cars in their factories. But each car also requires labor and materials, like steel and rubber for the tires and all this and that. Let's say that in order to build cars, Chrysler needs to spend $10 million on the equipment, and then each car requires another $15,000 worth of labor and materials. So in economics, this investment, this is referred to as fixed costs. It doesn't change whether we sell one car or a million cars. These costs are referred to as variable costs because they increase every time we sell a new car. So this is an extremely important distinction. The fixed costs are a one-time only investment, and that only has to be paid once. It never changes, no matter how many cars we sell. Whereas the labor and material, we call them variable costs because they increase with each car that we sell. So let's say we put up a chart here. Oh, and by the way, then we also define total costs, which, as you can imagine, is simply the total of the fixed and variable costs. But here's the number that really matters the most: average total cost. What we're doing here is we're taking the total cost of making all of our cars and dividing by the number that we actually produce. This is the number that is directly related to economies of scale. Okay, so we're going to see in our example that as we make more cars, this number is actually shrinking. All right, so watch this. So we're going to show a chart which shows the cost of producing anywhere from 10 to 100,000 cars. So let's take a look. Now, how does this work? These are the numbers of cars, which I'll call Q. The fixed costs stay always at $10 million. That never changes. Now, the variable costs, remember, each car requires $15,000 worth of labor and materials. So therefore, this number represents 15,000 times the number of cars. In this case, that happens to be $150 million. And if you notice, for 20,000 cars, the fixed costs haven't changed, but the variable costs have doubled. So every time I add another 10,000 cars, I'm adding $150 million to my variable costs. So these are the two columns rather, the total cost of the sum of these two. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see it's growing as we increase the number of cars. But here's the key detail. If I now divide this by Q and come up with an average, what do you see happening to these average costs? What's going on? I'm making more cars here, and what's going on to my average total costs? Let's see. It's going down, exactly. Is this giving me a motivation to get bigger? If I'm this company, do I want to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger? Because you can probably imagine, if I keep extending this chart, these numbers will just keep falling. Yes, I want to be huge. I want to be the biggest company in the world with this situation, because every time I sell more cars, the cost per unit is going down, and that puts more money in my pockets, because the selling price is not affected by any of this. We're selling more, and yet it costs less. All right. That's the key to the whole thing. And now I'm going to graph this for you and show you how this changes over output. So in other words, here's the average total costs. Here's the number of cars that I'm producing. And look what's happening. It's falling. And so this is what's happening with Walmart and Amazon. They keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the cost per unit is going down, down, down. So that means they will continue to get bigger because they have this enormous cost advantage over other companies. Okay, so in other words, if you want to start up a retail store, you do not try to compete with Walmart. What you do instead is you set up a store that has specialized products where you can have, specialized merchandise where people will pay more money for it, and leave the standard stuff to Walmart, because they have such a huge cost advantage than anybody else that comes along. It's kind of like, Barnes and Nobles is enormous too, although, the technology is making people go to bookstores less and less than they used to. But it used to be, especially in Manhattan 20, 30 years ago, in addition to the gigantic chains like Barnes and Nobles, and the other one was called, God, I already forgot what they were called. Oh, you remember Borders? That's right. God, they've been gone for so long, I couldn't even remember their name. There also used to be a lot of small specialized bookstores, especially in the big cities. Like, for example, even now in Manhattan, there's still a few that still have survived, where they only sell one kind of book, like stores that only specialize in, let's say, science fiction books, or or mysteries or something like that. And it used to be possible for the smaller stores to compete with the bigger stores, because while they didn't have the same low prices, they had a special service that you couldn't get at the gigantic chains. Well, now, the problem is that as people read less and less physical books, that's still not enough anymore for the small stores to stay competitive. And so most of them have disappeared. And even Borders itself disappeared because they did not jump into the bandwagon early enough and sell their products online. It was really Barnes and Nobles that just went into it full blast, and they survived because they're able to get all their books online a lot quicker than Borders. But even now, smaller bookstores will not be able to compete with Barnes and Nobles because of this principle of economies of scale. Like, let's say you're Barnes and Nobles, and a new hot bestseller comes out. you can order copies from the publisher at a much lower price than smaller stores because you have the ability to sell more copies, and they will give you a deal that reflects that. And then you can turn around and pass that along to your customers, and you could end up putting your rivals out of business. All right. So anyway, now if you extend this to the international sector, this company is in a good position to not only sell a lot of cars in the United States, but to foreign countries as well. They should be able to take advantage of this and now start exporting cars to foreign countries, giving the US a comparative advantage in cars because of economies of scale. Whereas in other countries, maybe the companies are smaller and they cannot take advantage of these same economies of scale. So the thrust of all this is that comparative advantage may result from economies of scale because it gives us a cost advantage, and that makes it easier to make money when we sell more of our products. Now, there's also something called external economies of scale, which is more to do with the entire industry. Like, for example, if you're in an industry which is attracting more specialized labor, this would be a good example of the early days of Silicon Valley. In other words, in the early days, it was all this excitement about these high-tech firms that were starting up in Silicon Valley. All of a sudden, all the country's best engineers start moving to California to work for these places. And so more and more specialized labor becomes available. And of course, specialized labor is highly productive. And that can reduce our costs of production. New knowledge, new skills that are being acquired by these workers. And in some cases, the government was also providing tax subsidies for research and development. So suddenly you reach this critical mass where you're getting bigger and bigger and bigger because all these special resources are becoming available to you. And so this is known as external economies of scale because it's not due to a single company, but due to the entire industry. And so this would have given them, this is companies like Intel, like we talked about before, or Apple. Apple started out with two guys building computers in their garage. Amazon started out as Jeff Bezos selling books out of his garage. And suddenly, before you know it, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, in the case of Bezos, it was because suddenly the internet became available to most people and it became possible to sell his products online. So that would have been considered external economies of scale because he did not, of course, invent the internet, but he was in a position to take advantage of it. So this means that, again, we're going to obtain a comparative advantage because it lowers our costs. Okay, and that means at some point, as we keep getting bigger, we'll be in a position to export our products to foreign countries. So Silicon Valley firms, Intel and Apple and all the rest would have gained some of their advantage from the so-called external economies of scale. Whereas here we're looking at, let's say, steel or auto manufacturers or retailers who are saving money by getting bigger and lowering their cost of production. Now, this doesn't happen in every industry, by the way. I just want to mention that. It's possible in some industries, you might see something like this taking place. Instead of the costs going down, let me just show you another possibility. For many industries, the average total cost never changes. It just stays the same. No matter how much you produce, it's just the same. And then in other cases, this is sometimes called constant returns to scale. And so this is not going to give you a comparative advantage. And here, it's the other way around. It's actually going up. And this is called decreasing. It has two possible names. We can call this decreasing returns to scale. Or sometimes it's called diseconomies of scale, which means that as we get bigger, our costs are actually going up. This would be the case on the right-hand side if you need very specialized resources, which are hard to find. Like if you make a product that can only be produced by people who have, let's say, a degree in mechanical engineering, let's say, it's going to be hard to find those people. And so as you keep hiring more and more of them, their wages will start to go up. And as you get bigger, that means the cost of production can actually rise. So in this kind of industry, the firms will tend to be very small. Whereas in the industry, the first case here, this is a case where the companies tend to be very large. Here, they tend to be small because being big is actually disadvantageous. What's interesting about constant returns to scale is that small and large firms can compete side by side because size is not helping or hurting them. Okay, so with the economies of scale, we tend to see a few large firms in that industry. In this case, we might have small and large companies competing side by side. And in this last case, this one tends to be characterized by small firms because getting big is actually harming them. Okay, so these two cases will not help us gain comparative advantage, but economies of scale will. All right, we're competing with countries that do not necessarily have these economies of scale. And so this is how we can gain a comparative advantage. All right, now there's this theory called overlapping demands, where trade in manufactured goods tends to be based on demand conditions in that country. Now, not every country wants the same things. The demand for different products is different in every country. So here we see that firms have an incentive to produce goods where there's a large domestic market, which means a strong demand for that product. And then the choice of which goods to produce will determine what we end up selling to foreign countries. Like, for example, how about McDonald's? Why does McDonald's make burgers and fries? They could make anything they wanted to. Why do they choose to focus on burgers and fries? What's going on there? Well, because we want burgers and fries. And then when McDonald's decides to build a new branch overseas, let's say they open up new stores in foreign countries, where do they typically go first? Well, how about Canada or England or maybe Australia? Countries that have similar demands to American audiences or, the American market. And then they save for last countries where they're not so sure about that. Like, for example, there are McDonald's in Japan, but they tend to offer very different products than what you'll get here. In fact, I was looking at this up one day. Let's just check this out for a second. All right. In regular items here in Japanese McDonald's are the teriyaki McBurger. Have you ever seen that in the United States? No. Why not? Because nobody would want it. That's the bottom line. Shake-a chicken, filet o shrimp. Is there any McDonald's in the United States that sells shrimp? No. Why? No, of course not. You're not going to find that here. Look what else they have. This is Japan. Yes. Look at some of this stuff. Green tea flavored milkshakes. Wow. Look at some of this stuff. the Tsukimi burger, moon viewing burger, which has a poached egg in it. Jeez. Um, Look at some of this stuff. The quarter pounder jewelry burgers, salsa burger. Man, they've got some wild stuff there. Because so you know that this would have come later. The early McDonald's would not have been placed in Japan because they knew the market was very different. Um, they would have started out in other countries more similar to the United States, like like Canada. Now, in India, they have a real problem there. They don't sell beef because obviously in India most people are Hindus and they don't believe in killing cattle, so they're going to have something different. Oh, and pork either. Wow, um, man, that's got to be challenging. What's interesting too is that in Germany they actually sell beer in McDonald's in Germany. I know that because I know people who live in Germany, and it's a very different culture over there with respect to their beer. They take it very seriously, and there nobody. Oh, okay. It says here it is still serving older outlets by German brewers releasing. I wonder what happened there. It used to be they all had it. This is very interesting to see what they offer in these different McDonald's throughout the world, because it's an indication of what's popular and not popular in those countries. If you think it's the same everywhere, no. Although I haven't been to a ton of them, I do know though that the ones in Canada and England are identical to the ones here, except for obviously the prices are in a different currency. But that's about all that I know. I'm trying to find something shocking. Look at that. McDonald's has donuts for breakfast in France, and they have Kronenbourg beer. Oh, I didn't know about that. How do you like that? All right. Well, anyway, so what they're trying to say here, though, is that a company like McDonald's would tend to gain an advantage because what's happening is that they are selling something in the domestic market, which is very popular in some of these other countries that they're about to move into, like England and Canada. So this is how they can increase international trade through the so-called overlapping demands, which simply means trade with countries that have similar tastes to your own country. Okay. Also, this involves incomes. Like for example, imagine a store like Tiffany's. What is true about Tiffany's? What makes it different from other stores? Has anyone ever seen a Tiffany's? There's one in the Westchester Mall, by the way. If you've never noticed it down there on the bottom floor, what are they known for? What do they sell in Tiffany's? Well, diamonds, among other things, jewelry, very expensive high-end stuff. So if you're the owner of Tiffany's, exactly, and you're thinking about opening an overseas branch, where are you likely to go? What kind of countries would you be looking for? Wealthier countries, right? Exactly. In other words, you might find yourself in, let's say, England or France or Japan. Not so much, let's say, I don't know, a country like Indonesia, for example, where the per capita income is significantly lower than it would be in Western Europe. I just randomly picked Indonesia, but that might not be the best place to start with the Tiffany's. You're looking for other countries where you can sell diamonds to people who have a lot of money. On the other hand, if you're selling like burgers, like even though McDonald's would have originally only moved into more American-like countries, eventually they found themselves in every country in the world. And why is that? There's McDonald's can thrive in almost all these countries by, of course, adjusting their menu a little bit, but the basic business model is the same. You're getting value for your money. They're selling you something that you can eat quickly, which you like the taste of. And so you feel like you're getting a bargain and you're getting your food very quickly. That model would work in every country in the world. And so that's why they can be in all these different countries. Whereas a Tiffany's would probably be restricted to just a few countries where there's enough money for people to buy diamonds. Okay, so this is all part of the overlapping demands theory, which is an attempt to explain why sometimes countries trade the same types of products with each other. All right. Okay. What time's? Oh, I think it's getting a little late here. There's not that much more here to discuss. There's a couple more theories. And then what we're going to do in chapter 4 is introduce our first look at how governments interfere with trade. We're going to look at something called tariffs, which are basically a tax on imported goods, which are designed to discourage domestic consumers from buying foreign products. Okay, now you may not even notice it when you buy foreign products that tariffs have been imposed on them. It's hard to tell, you can't tell when you buy a foreign product how much of that price was from a tariff. But a lot of products that come into the US are taxed, and those taxes are called tariffs. In fact, you know how you know this is happening? Has anyone here ever been to a duty-free shop at an airport? No. Oh, okay. Has that? All right. Anybody? No. Every airport, at least international airports, all have a duty-free shop where you can buy a lot of these products with no import tariffs attached to them. Typically, they offer, for some reason, they tend to offer cigarettes, liquors, perfumes, chocolates, and a few other products that are very common, and the others not so much. But you can save a lot of money in these places because for whatever reason, you're allowed to buy them without the tariff. And that's how you can find out how high these tariffs really are by looking at the prices in the duty-free shop compared to your local store. So liquor especially tends to have huge tariffs on it. Like, let's say a product like Kahlua, which comes from Mexico. If you were in Mexico, the cost of a bottle of Kahlua could be less than half what it is in the United States. And the vast majority of that difference is coming from the tariffs. Okay, and this is what's actually happening. The US government is basically saying you can have all the Kahlua you want, but you just have to pay more because we're trying to protect the domestic US liquor industry. So we're going to look at how tariffs are imposed and what kind of costs they impose on consumers and producers, and if there are any benefits to tariffs. All right. So we're going to see a lot of graphs in that chapter, by the way. Here, not so much, but in the next chapter, chapter 4, we'll be looking at a lot of graphs, which I think it's very helpful to understand what we're doing. All right, so I guess we can cut it off right here, and we will say goodbye until Thursday. And yes, I will be posting these solutions as soon as we're done, so you can look at them and follow along and see if you understand what we were doing. All right. So I guess I'll just see you all on Thursday.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay,
Thank
you're
you.
welcome.
Have a good day.
Okay. All right, bye.